This is Football at 4.
Football at 4, powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. And, of course, it is brought to you by Bet365, which you can, whatever the sport, whatever the moment, it's never ordinary at Bet365. The Inside the Birds podcast you can get on all podcasting platforms and their YouTube channel. Just search Inside the Birds. Geoff Mosher is here today from Inside the Birds podcast. And, man, a lot going on this week, Geoff, as the mini camps finished last week. And now, holy mackerel, everybody over-analyzing everything potentially that they heard. Are people going crazy about what Jalen Hurts said or didn't say about Nick Sirianni when asked about, kind of role he is adjusting into?
Oh, yeah. While you were across the pond, Mike, drinking it up at your beer mile and having fun watching the Phillies, we plebeians back here in the Delaware Valley had to deal with some crazy reactions to Eagles press conferences. So you should be doubly happy about your trip across the pond.
Well, believe me, people over there were talking about it too. I'll tell you that much.
Not surprised me.
Yeah, it just happened to be that the story made its way to London. And, I guess there's a couple ways you could look at this thing. My biggest thing is the guy gets asked a question. He answers it in a, could he have been more flattering? Sure. But isn't this who Jalen Hurts has been?
Yeah. Josh and I talked about that when I was on with him, that I like to use the phrase to keep it clean for the family audience here, that Jalen Hurts has never, ever been one to just shovel the feces in a press conference. He says what comes to mind. And expanding on that, what often comes to his mind in a press conference is not a whole lot, because he doesn't really want to win the press conference. And quite often you think that he doesn't even want to be there answering questions. There are thousands of questions that Jalen Hurts has answered with sort of dismissive one-word answers or very non-answer type answers. Now, you just mentioned it, did that answer come off as anti-Nick Sirianni? I think that's a little bit of a reach, although I can't be inside his head. But it certainly didn't come off as pro-Nick Sirianni either. But my bigger takeaway, Mike, was, and whether it's an extension of the question that was asked or some other comments that he made, is that he doesn't really sound like a guy who's really enthused about having to learn yet another new offense. And especially, this is me now editorializing, the last two offenses, 2 years ago, he was an MVP candidate in one of them. Last year, not as good, clearly, but when you take an offense that you've been an MVP candidate in and it gets a little stale, your mindset is, okay, this needs to be freshened up, right? We can change a little this, change a little that. Well, he ain't getting that. He's getting another new offense, new concepts, new this, new that. And I think most quarterbacks who are entering year 5 want to start to get to that area of stability and building off a root or base offense and not having to learn a new one time and time again.
Yeah, that's fair. And his answer to that was fine. Hey, 95% of the offense, I want to master this thing. I want it to be mine. He gives a solid answer there. The question he's asked about Sirianni, hey, what's he kind of doing? He's like, that's a good question. It's almost like, but I guess I can see how that comes off as almost like dismissive of like, I don't know what he's doing, or why, why is he even here? Like, people ask that question, like, what is he going to be doing?
Right.
How much hand did Sirianni have in the offense? I know it was his playbook, but when Shane Steichen was here, like, was he just kind of an overseer, or is he very involved? And is he now just kind of,
yeah,
you know what I'm saying? Like, that's what we don't know.
He's very involved, Mike. The offense, the offense itself was a byproduct of his vision, Kevin Patullo's vision. If you really want to peel back a layer in the onion, what is Kevin Patullo's job now? He's the passing game coordinator, but this is not his passing game. At least Nick Sirianni gets to be the head coach of the rest of the team and still oversee. But, last 2 years, the whole Nick Sirianni offense was Nick, Kevin Patullo, his assistants, Jeff Stoutland, run game coordinator, which I imagine Jeff will still be doing that, but entirely new passing game and passing concepts that they talk about harmony and blending, but it's really Kellen Moore's offense.
I don't know how I could see a disconnect or friction between Sirianni and Hurts. Wouldn't that have been taken care of in the decision to keep Sirianni?
I don't think so. Not necessarily. That's it's Jalen Hurts not the owner, right? So
right. Well, what did the owners?
I'm not saying there is a friction, but I'm just saying if one existed, I don't think the ownership is going to be like, Jalen Hurts has this friction where, we have to fire the coach. Ownership has to consider the fact that if you fire the coach 2 years after a Super Bowl, what does that say about the franchise? What does it say about since Andy Reid? You've had 3 different coaches, none of them lasting more than 5 years. There's a whole lot to think about there.
Yeah,
Finding
but
a new guy.
This is a pretty big decision with coach and quarterback. Like, I don't want to have animosity if my coach and quarterback don't get along, and I know that. I have the ability to whack my coach, right?
Mm-hmm.
Fans wouldn't have. I don't think there would have been an uproar of the fans if they fired Nick Sirianni. This wasn't like Doug Peterson, who I know he got to a Super Bowl. But I think it's a little different.
There probably wouldn't have been an uproar because fans are sort of, what have you done for late me and fickle? But I'm sure a week after the firing, right, there's going to be a whole lot of discussion while we're looking for the next Eagles head coach about how this franchise can't seem to figure out how to hire coaches ever since Andy Reid left. So no matter how you slice it, it's not looking good on the organization.
I don't know. That's a tough one, man.
Do you not agree? Since Andy Reid, if you don't have, it's going to be 15 years. Well, 2012. Yeah, we're getting up on that. And if Nick Sirianni doesn't make it past this year, that's 3 coaches who had peaks and valleys. Chip didn't really have peaks, but he wasn't awful either. But you can't have 3 different coaches in 15 years and call yourself a stable franchise. I don't care how much success you have in individual seasons. That's tough.
It is, but it
opens up the door to, like, what are you looking for in a head coach? Is this puppet guy you're always going to control? And then we start talking about, well, was Nick Sirianni any good? Was Doug Peterson any good? Or was it really that just how he built a great 53? And can you coexist with a guy having to build the greatest 53 every single year when you know that's not going to happen and not possible?
Yeah, it's hard because the guys you mentioned, other than Chip, all did as much, if not more, than Andy did when Andy was here. And Andy went to 4 NFC Championship games, but he went to a Super Bowl and lost. Nick has been to the playoffs 3 times, went to a Super Bowl and lost. Doug won a Super Bowl. So it's not like these guys have been stiffs and haven't accomplished anything. All 3, both of them, other than Chip, they do feel like they picked the right guy. It's just, why does it keep going awry at this stage?
I don't know. I think we can have a great discussion about this in the offseason if things don't work out and Nick gets fired. The discussion is, do they pick the right guy, or do they have the right guy assembling a roster who, when he gets it right, is great, but when he doesn't get it right, is not great? You have 2020, a terrible year. You have a year where you collapse and lose 6 of your last 7. That's a whole lot of pressure that your GM has to produce the best 53-man roster in the league every year for your team to win. The Patriots they had the best quarterback, right? They didn't always have the best 53. Teams that win don't always have the best 53.
That's absolutely true. No, you're absolutely right about that. It's just a weird dynamic. To me, I look at this and I'm like, are we supposed to think, is it because it's June 12th, the Phillies are 10 games up, are we really supposed to think that Jalen Hurts and Nick Sirianni have some sort of disconnect or friction? Or is it just the time of the year?
I don't know. Ray, I get the spirit of your question. I certainly am not trying to imply that there definitely is a friction. I've heard that there is. I feel like I would have heard it pretty strongly if these guys didn't like each other or one didn't like the other, that we would know about that. But there are certain things that always stick out. They're clearly wired differently. Nick Sirianni is hot-headed. Where's the notions on the food? I think it was a Super Bowl. They're doing a catch.
Moshe, I lost you. You sound like you're out in London.
Down and puts it down. If that happens in a game that the team is losing, the whole discussion is really different. Right?
Yeah, it sounds like he kind of got distant or something there. See if you can get him a little back on board here. He was giving us a lot of good stuff. Talk with Geoff Mosher from the Inside the Birds podcast, InsideTheBirds.com. There's been a lot of discussion regarding the coach and quarterback and the answer that Hurts gave, which, he essentially was asked, what do you think of the job that Nick Sirianni's doing and in his new role. And he kind of chuckled and was like, huh, it's a good question. And it could be looked at a bunch of different ways. Like maybe he's saying this is kind of the same Nick that it's always been. Like, I don't know how hands-on he was over these last couple days. There's also a far-out scenario, I guess far out, that maybe Sirianni, who, by the way, is like the chief of pandering, right? Sirianni can pander with the best of people. He certainly is a guy who knows his surroundings. Sirianni is a smart guy. He knows his surroundings. He is the chief panderer. He wears his Philly stuff, his Sixer stuff. He gets it. So is it so far-fetched to think that Sirianni had come to a revelation that, hey, it is time to change our offense up? My offense became stale, and it was time. Or do we think that he has some animosity the way this has gone? Let's bring Geoff back in as you were giving a good expository on something, but you sounded like you were in London.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me better now.
I can.
We good?
Yes.
I was saying that I didn't mean to suggest or imply that there's some definite rift between them. If there was, I feel like I would have heard that by now. But what I'm saying is that they're definitely wired differently. You know, one guy is more hot-headed and wears emotions on his sleeve. The other guy's more stoic, right? And it does, like, little moments stick out to me. The Super Bowl where Devontae Smith's catch was being reviewed. After review, Nick Sirianni sticks his hand out, first down. Jalen Hurts pushes it down, okay? Playful when you're winning and going to the Super Bowl. What would happen if that same thing happened in a game that they were losing, right? People would have been talking about that in a completely different context. So I do wonder about, like, the way they're both wired and if that ever interferes. But I don't see Jalen Hurts as going out there looking to intentionally disrespect his head coach the way some people have interpreted that press conference.
Yeah, and, you know, like, it's funny because I never got a sense of, like, what their relationship is, good, bad, and different. It just seems like, you know, they're such different personalities. Nick is the guy who, yes. You know, it's almost like the bigger brother who the younger brother's always, like, getting out of hand. He's always hanging around, but he's always got to kind of keep him in line because the younger brother's the mouthy one and the older – because he knows he's got his older brother to back him up, you know? Like, I'll be the mouthy one because if I get into a fight, older brother will be the one that pops the guy in the face for me. That almost seems like their relationship here.
Well, it's a little weird, though.
But it should be the other way around. Right, it should be the other way around.
Right.
Yeah, and like, yeah. I wonder, like, this whole thing with Sirianni, like, he gets retained. There wasn't like, hey, we thought about it. Like, they were kind of like, there was no decision. He's our coach. And so here he is. He's not a lame duck guy. But did Sirianni have this epiphany that, hey, my offense doesn't work anymore. It's time to turn the page and change? Or did they tell him? I think that kind of comes back into the conversation now.
Certainly does. And, you know, we know that when they say there's no discussion to have here, that he was definitely coming back. We know that that's not true, that there was a discussion about it, that his future was definitely in doubt. And I think it's a really valid question to raise, whether Nick Sirianni really wanted to make the change or if he read the room and knew that the last guy who won a Super Bowl got fired because he didn't want to make a change, so that he better go to that meeting and say, yes, we need to change. My ideas got – it's very rare for a coach to say, my ideas were stale, they got bad, we needed a new look. I mean, extraordinarily rare. I'm sure, Mike, that sort of caught you by surprise to hear him say that as well. So you wonder if it was one of three things. One, if it was forced upon him. Two, he forced it upon himself because he wanted to keep his job. Or three, it was just there was no other recourse. This is where we have to go.
Yeah, and, like, listen, I don't know. Well, we were talking about this morning. I was on with McMullen, and, you know, he brought up the thing that did the Phillies, did the Eagles, like, did he go to them and say, like, knowing, because like I said, Sirianni's a pretty smart guy. He knows what's around him. Did he beat them to it by saying, hey, we got to get rid of the coordinators? Or did he wait for them to tell him?
Well, I mean, I think the defensive coordinator situation was obvious. I think that was that was a no-brainer for anybody involved. Our offensive coordinator is where I think we have the valid question of, did Nick Sirianni make this decision out of self-preservation mode, or did he really truly believe that they would be better off with a new offensive coordinator? I kind of think it's A, not B, but because again, Brian Johnson was calling plays from his playbook, from him and Kevin Petula. I mean, this is what they do. It's very, very difficult for a guy to be like, you know what, I'm really not that good, so we'll just it doesn't jive with how most coaches are wired.
Yeah,
so I kind of think he was in self-preservation mode.
Yeah, it's almost like, hey, like if you're looking at this from ownership to GM down to the coach, if they all got together, hey, what made us successful? Well, Shane, he's a head coach. John, he's a head coach. We need to get stronger coordinators. And Nick says, yeah, I'm on board with that. Like, I realize not having those guys here hurt our team last year. Could it just been as simple as everybody kind of opening their eyes and all getting on the same page of what was wrong here?
I mean, could it be? Sure. But again, like Brian, it was Nick Sirianni's offense. It was that team's offense. And the year before, it was pretty darn good. And almost every coach I know will tell you that, yes, they have to make changes to avoid becoming stale, but those are usually tinkerings and alterations, not completely throwing it out the window and hiring somebody else.
Yeah.
I mean, when you do that, you're basically saying if the next guy comes in and works well, I guess it works out well for you. You get to keep your job. But if it doesn't work out well, you're gone.
Yeah. All right, listen, look, it's June, and I know a lot of people.
If I were gone, Mike, if I knew I were going to be gone, if it doesn't work out well, I'm not putting that in somebody else's hands. I'm just taking my offense and trying to fix it and do a better job myself. I'm not letting somebody else determine my future.
I think that's fair unless he's lost confidence in himself, and that would be an indictment on himself, too. I mean,
correct.
You know what I'm saying? Like, if that's the case, then he's already showing weakness to the front office, and then they would have to be thinking, man, did we make a mistake here? But, hey, I know in my mind, I don't know, Jalen Hurts is an interesting guy. He's almost like a Chase Utley who just gives you nothing, right? He's just like a guy who just gives you zero. He says something, and then when he seemingly says nothing, you're trying to make him say something.
Yeah, Mike. I mean, I hear you. I'm with you. I'm not trying to make too much of it either. But at the same time, I feel like 9 out of 10 quarterbacks, no matter how dull or mundane they are, they figure out a way in a press conference when they're a high-profile player in a big city like this, to figure out a way to say something that's pretty antiseptic and is not going to be taken as overly pro or overly anti. And he just didn't do that.
A couple quick hits with Geoff. Couple things that happened at minicamp that now raise your interest for training camp.
Okay.
What do you got? What are some of the things that happened at minicamp that have intrigued you enough that you want to see the next chapter at minicamp, at training camp?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Zach Bond thing is interesting. You know, he was working at inside linebacker, more so than edge. Not really a position he's played a whole lot of. They got Nakobe Dean. I still think when the season starts, we talk about this in Inside the Birds podcast will drop tomorrow morning, you know, where we sort of look at what we think the depth chart looks like now coming out of these camps. I still think when the season begins, Nakobe Dean will be a starting linebacker next to Devin White, unless he just does not look the part in training camp, and Zach Bond does. But we're far from there. But that was interesting. And I'll tell you what, Mike, I think the biggest thing that intrigues me coming out of camp and just looking at the team big picture is if Quinyon Mitchell is what he's supposed to be, right? And Cooper DeJean, like if these guys, they have a young influx of talent here at corner. And if Isaiah Rodgers and Keely Ringo are just good enough to be solid backups, that gives the Eagles more depth at that position that they may have had in 30 years. I'm not exaggerating. 30 years. Go look at the year they won the Super Bowl. Cornerback might have been their weakest position and probably why they gave up 500 yards in the Super Bowl. right? It's been a long time since you've had not just – I mean, it's been a long time since the Eagles had two really good starting corners, but even a third or a fourth guy off the bench that you think could come in, hold his own, especially on the outside, right? So if these guys pan out, we're excited about some of these names like Keely Ringo, Isaiah Rodgers, or Ricks, or Joe, whatever, Cooper DeJean, Quinyon Mitchell. That makes the Eagles look a lot different than they've looked for a long, long time.
Oh, I think that corner thing is going to be so interesting to the point where there's almost too many guys in the room. You might have to think about moving one of them. And, do you use one of these young guys to try to get that third wide receiver? Do you go to a team that's got, hey, we got a logjam at wide receiver depth, young guys. We'll flip-flop like that because Howie's done a lot of player-for-player stuff.
He has done that. It'll be interesting. It'll be interesting trying to assess the value of a young guy like a Rodgers or a Ringo or a Ricks or a Job who don't have a whole lot of playing experience, or in the case of Rodgers where he's been off for more than a year. But yeah, Howie is very creative and figures out ways to do things in differently than most. So that will be interesting.
Geoff Mosher, the Inside the Birds podcast. Make sure you check that out on all podcasting platforms. And, of course, the YouTube channel. Just search Inside the Birds, football at 4 on the YouTube channel as well. You can get every edition. Tomorrow, Andrew and Adam's back on Friday. We'll have plenty more on this Eagles offseason, which, is kind of in the quiet period right now. But there'll be plenty of NFL stuff to go on through the summer here as we get almost to training camp. Yes, I said training camp. That will be here before we know it. Geoff Mosher, everybody. Thanks, bud.
All right, Mike. Take care. Have a good one.